I will begin now. Alan, John, thank you for admitting other people that might be trickling in on the Zoom in a bit. Um, I'm not going to be looking at the chat or anything like that. So this all will be recorded. So if there end up being audio issues or visual stuff or any other problems later, I will be posting this as an unlisted YouTube video. So if anybody wants to view it later or share with other people like board members and whatnot, it will be available later for that purpose. So I wanted to invite all of you to my project, which has been a partnership between the University Alliance here on campus and the Village of DeForest. It's part of a series of projects that will be ongoing over the next, I think it's 3 years is your partnership, with this one kind of being the first. Each one kind of has a different facet related to different operational problems within the community. And this one is more geared towards the natural resource preservation and sustainable development end of things. So I chose to work on kind of a green infrastructure network or a framework to think about planning for the future with a focus on reducing phosphorus levels and protecting the natural assets within the village. That's my bubble. Great. So I kind of have 7 sections of the presentation today. I'll start with a background of the community as well as the project and how it came to be and some kind of initial discussions to select what we focused on. We'll look at some existing natural asset protections when it comes to environmental designations that already exist in the area that can inform future planning processes. And then we'll look at green infrastructure as a potential solution and a specific analysis framework that exists from Esri and the Green Infrastructure Center on a national scale that we can use to modify for a municipality locally here, such as this project. Then I'll share some of the background analysis methodology that I used and what I changed to make it work for the Village of DeForest, and then some green infrastructure network priority zones that I've identified for some specific suggestions moving forward, with a main focus on the fringe areas and the extraterritorial jurisdiction zones of DeForest, given that that is where the most concerns are when thinking about development expansion in this region. And then we'll end with a couple closing thoughts and some recommendations of kind of step 2 of what other projects that students or the village could take on later to kind of continue this planning process. So the Village of DeForest is located in northeast of Dane County near the Ohio River headwaters. There are approximately 11,000 residents living there presently, but that is projected to increase by about 60% from the population in 2010 up through 2050. In addition to residential growth, there will be also a lot of non-residential development, specifically in the sectors of distribution, warehousing, and manufacturing, given that its close proximity to major transportation networks are making it very attractive place for businesses to locate their facilities. Within their comprehensive planning vision statement, natural resources, outdoor recreation, and opportunities for these businesses to grow are definitely key things that the village holds to be important. Extending into their stewardship of the land is kind of one of the other premises of their projects, especially when it comes to think about managing the growth and combining that with increased issues such as flooding in the region. Currently, the village has about 300 acres of land that are under environmental corridor designations for protection. Some of these are in the forms of parks or greenways or stormwater management, and they're working on a very large stream restoration project along the Yahara specifically, along with Stantec, to work on stabilizing banks and increasing restoration within the riparian zone. Recently, this spring, a lot of this stream has been reclassified to a Class 2 trout stream by the DNR. So these efforts are definitely paying off, and this is kind of an extension of what can they do further outside of that zone to continue that work. Right now, there's a lot of community support, according to village staff, for these types of projects. However, there's conflicting opinions between village staff, residents, and incoming developers on what types of development should occur and where, as well as the proximity to the river itself. So given that there's some issues surrounding that, we're hoping that we can kind of set aside lands ahead of time as yes, build here, don't build there, or put something here, not there, sort of thing, as a framework before some of these things start going in as for discussion purposes. And to guide the future land use planning in the region on the more county level, the Capital Area Regional Planning Commission has established a variety of designations for lands when it comes to land protections. However, a lot of these definitions can be very confusing. There's a lot of them. Only 3 of the many are listed up here on the board right now, because the county, CARC-C, state, and various communities across the county all have slightly different definitions, or have definitions that sound nearly identical but mean something completely different, or have different criteria of what land should be included within each one. Been having conversations with CARC-C recently this summer, and they're looking to change that. They've started conversations with the county, Land and Water Organization, and local municipalities and internally to try to consolidate all of these definitions to increase clarity in both the naming conventions of titles of designations, as well as for ease of use for municipalities for planning, to make it very clear what land should be included in what type of designation area, as well as the implications for if something is going to be expanded into with an urban service area amendment, how can we think about protecting that before when it's still more of a rural setting. They were kind enough to share some draft working versions and definitions, which are included in the appendix of my report itself that I can share with folks later, which are specifically related to environmental corridors, protection areas, and stewardship areas. The rest of them are still in working conversations, and if anyone's interested, CARC-C did just post that in September they're going to be having a kickoff meeting for an internal working group that will be discussing these definition updates that should be done in conjunction with the county water quality planning process. And that's where all those are housed. Luckily, Village of DeForest has already been utilizing the CARC-C definition, so they have less of confusion going on. But most of this is hinging around, are you inside or outside of the urban service area? And then legal designations that go along with that. Certain things such as floodplains and wetlands already have designations for protection, whether they're inside or outside of those zones, but a lot of other features that are key for habitat protection are not protected until they become included in that. And so kind of the distribution you can see across Dane County right now for specifically the green or the environmental corridors, or the little green areas within the red urban surface area zones. So we're thinking about, well, what can we do kind of outside of that? On a landscape scale is more what you need to do when you're thinking about green infrastructure. It's all about those connections of things. And green infrastructure is made up of natural assets across the landscape, such as forests, waterways, and parks that form this natural system of interconnected ecological processes that protect native species and provide human beings benefits such as clean water, clean air, healthy lifestyles, and significant economic benefits. And so kind of the science behind a green infrastructure, where I will abbreviate in many of the slides, GI framework for sustainable growth and conservation, include factors such as environmental protections. So green infrastructure is protecting health and diversity of wildlife and maintaining natural systems that deliver critical life-sustaining services, as well as contributing to a thriving economy. Green infrastructure benefits property values that are in the region, lowers healthcare costs, boosts tourism, and helps communities make smarter investments in great infrastructure, as there would be less investment in that if you already have these blue and green infrastructures existing. And as well as enhanced quality of life, given that people have a closer connection with nature in the area and have access to that water and clean air and water, which leads to happier and healthier lives. And there's a bunch of research that supports all of that. But within a green infrastructure network, the key pieces are having 4 areas, as kind of shown here on the left graphic. The definition of a core area varies greatly. It depends on what criteria you are trying to preserve things for. But the general gist, depending on, regardless of what you're preserving things for, is that it's typically a large contiguous area of something that works to be able to preserve whatever it is you're trying to preserve. Things like a bear population, for example, need a very, very large tract of land, given that they need a lot more resources in a larger area. But something like worms or a particular plant species we shouldn't preserve worms in the US. They're an invasive species. That's a bad example, but the comparison makes sense. But all these areas effectively are connected by corridor systems or pathways that connect these particular core areas. Especially in the region that we're in with the forest, fragmentation is a big concern, as well as in other places, because of constructing transportation networks, expansion of residential areas or business parks, the expansion of agricultural fields and lands, and modifications of those areas which may remove or change hydraulic processes or existence of plant species and things like that. And so those areas become smaller and smaller. However, if we have numerous little tiny bits that we can preserve, and if they're close enough together, that's still collectively as a whole doing some benefit for that region. And so that's kind of what the graphic at the right is representing, having these little stepping stone places. And when we look at transferring this methodology to a smaller place, we'll discuss later, we're focusing on stepping stones. I'm not using a 100-acre size core area like would be used on a national scale because it's not feasible here. But we're looking to just connect to the greater system. All right, so the Green Infrastructure Center, which is a national group that has partnered with Esri, who's kind of like the, thank you, Alan, for admitting people. Can I close that? I'll just, I guess, do that. So the Green Infrastructure Center has partnered with Esri, who's kind of like the Microsoft of the GIS world. GIS is making maps and other geospatial analyses. They've come up with this whole textbook process for how to create a green infrastructure network or plan for a region with this 6-step process, with the first being to set goals. So in speaking with folks from the village and reading through a lot of their existing plans, the 2 main goals that we came up with are protecting surface water quality by reducing the phosphorus load entering the Ahar River from untreated stormwater runoff, as well as reducing the impacts of flooding from stormwater on infrastructure and the natural environment. And then we used a variety of data sources, both from the village themselves, from their consultant who manages their data, as well as public sourced information. All of those are found within the appendix as well of my report. And we use that to make asset maps and determine opportunities. Assessing risk and implementation of the plan would be for a part 2 to this project. But within asset maps, the general gist is looking at natural habitat, hey Judd, as well as developed lands and kind of removing those from each other to figure out kind of the core existing naturally occurring green infrastructure areas that exist in the zone, and then using that along with figuring out what's already protected so we can figure out what we need to focus on to then rank all of those areas and create kind of priority zones. All of that is done in a very large, and don't expect you to read this, model system, but I put this up there just for you all at the village to know that this model is already built, and the nice thing is you can change the inputs into it. You can have your consultant do that. So if you're like, yep, we would like a buffer zone of XYZ, all they have to do is change a button in here, rerun the model, and it will spit something else out for you. So all these files I will be sharing later, but that's the general gist of what's that included in that, and that was through a product called Model Builder through ArcGIS Pro, the software program that you're familiar with. All right, so in that existing assets section of things, this is kind of, if you look at all natural habitat related stuff, that's thinking about where are wetlands. And for this purpose of this project, I only included currently mapped wetlands. Looking at potentially restorable things is something we could totally do in the future. It was a rabbit hole I started down, but it's a lot of assumptions can be made. So as some of these more definitions from CARP-C and the county are agreed upon, it'd be really nice maybe as a part 2 to be able to look at those considerations for future planning processes. But if you kind of combine what, where are all of our rivers existing, where are existing tracts of forest lands, wetlands, and other features, and put them all into one layer, all the green areas you see in the map here on the left would be considered your natural habitat areas. I did not end up removing anything that was a tiny, tiny fragment, just because, again, I had no scientific basis to set a specific land area for a core, but if you ever did that later, you could definitely refine this further. Then you take all the developed lands, so where all of our roads, buildings, overlaying all that stuff together and putting a 30-meter buffer, which is a scientifically backed distance in terms of the distance away from a building or a road where there's kind of this abiotic transition zone. That basically means that if you have kind of prairie land maybe next to a building, that first 30 meters away from that building is not very useful when you think about a core habitat area. It's everything outside of that that's further away from the effects of that building being there. And so that's everything, including that buffer, are here in gray. And then if you take all of the natural habitat that might overlap with these developed lands, because If you read the report, you can go into the specifics and we can chat about this later if you have specific questions. With the natural habitat, it's at a 30-meter by 30-meter square. If you think about Bascom Hill, that's just outside this building, that's from our measurements, approximately, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 blocks would fit on that entire hill. So a pretty large land area when you think about your smaller, compact residential areas and whatnot. So there's some variability when they're designating land as this is all forest. There might be one house still within that or something like that. So this is one way to kind of try to combat that, of having this finer scale information of road and building infrastructure information to further refine that natural habitat area. So those became all the existing green infrastructure cores, which I then ranked. Now, this is not a very specific methodology. It just was enough in my mind to be able to differentiate some of these larger to smaller areas. And this was something that I had a hard time finding for a smaller scale municipality level project, what different appropriate area sizes might be. So as you're thinking about within the village itself later for planning processes, maybe you could be taking something like Western Green Park or the areas up in the northern portion of the community that you already have reserved and use those as your extra large core, or whatever term you want to use, to be able to kind of make comparisons against each other. But the general gist of this was to show things like the lake that's up in Columbia County that's way far away from you, as well as kind of the Cherokee Marsh area here are 2 very large tracts that are already existing. And the whole point is hopefully then to connect up in between them along the Yahara River corridor to be able to have these little patches to connect to each other rather than trying to create new giant cores. All right. So we could take those existing cores and then overlay ownership of those lands. There's a national database. It's like a protected area database. I can share all those files with you as well. And that basically takes anything that a municipality, a state, a county, government, or a nonprofit group, so things like Ducks Unlimited, or Groundswell Conservancy, or land trusts, or if you have other private easements that exist, they all go into this big database and are shared. And you can overlay that and say, all right, if something's already protected, we don't care about it in terms of prioritizing new places to be focusing our efforts. So I overlaid those together and was able to then rank these core areas. So, understanding that, especially down here near the Cherokee Marsh area, there's a lot more land ownership. It's not just one giant contiguous parcel. So what percentage of that core region is currently protected? Luckily, you have a lot of huge tracts. I was really impressed. If you look at the rest of the county and run this, it doesn't quite look like that. So you definitely have a big asset in that front, that your existing buffer system is definitely working. So when focusing on prioritization of the areas, I'll show you kind of some zones where we can think about moving forward. But most of the areas that are just in kind of the orangey to red areas are the less protected zones. So you still have some existing natural habitat, but maybe it's degraded in some way if there's more effects in the region. So again, focusing on the outskirts, given that that's where development's pushing in your region, I kind of created 4 priority zones based off of some of your existing feature, like FUTA study, for example, or your extraterritorial jurisdiction. Alex from your planning staff was mentioning, focus on the West, what's happening to the West. And so these are kind of some areas that we can look at to say, maybe there's either some pressures, like in the case of this priority zone 4, from development into areas that are larger cores, or in the case of like zone 3 or 2, maybe there's kind of some missing connection points here that we could be expanding that corridor. Now to jump into kind of the second part of that, thinking about phosphorus levels, this is where I was looking back at the same land cover data that I was using to get natural habitat information from, and then assigning specific estimated pollutant loads values based on it that are all from the Wisconsin DNR and normalized for our state. I took, which is called the PRESTO, which is the pollutant load ratio estimation tool. They have a whole GIS tool that you can run, but I found that at a HUC 12 level and even in their methodology, it's not an appropriate use of it. So I was just using the numbers instead of their actual tool to be able to calculate inputs and outputs. But if you were to work with neighboring communities, you could possibly instead then do this at a larger scale. A HUC 10 watershed scale, which from the very, very beginning is kind of including just over the border up into Columbia County area or Windsor, those other neighboring communities, it would be an appropriate use of that scale or larger, according to DNR. basically you can say, all right, if we have agriculture here or forest land or whatever type of land cover, you can associate an estimated amount of phosphorus load annually. And this can be overlaid with those core areas and any other information you want later to be able to then estimate. So I know that that was something that you were hoping for in the future, is to be able to say, all right, if we put something here, how would that change? And that's for the we need an engineer part at the end that I will mention, but I have a plan for that. So I was looking at all that, and basically the general gist is, okay, if we focus on these outer areas, already highly developed areas and agricultural lands tend to be where your highest phosphorus loads are coming from. And so that was part of what informed visually, rather than an actual analysis scientifically, of where I might be able to put those priority zones. So for priority zone number 1, which is up at the northern end, which I know we've spent a lot of time talking about, and land ownership in this area. One landowner happens to own a lot of the land that's around kind of this orangey lime area in the middle, which is, I think, partially why it's saying it's partially protected, since while they own it privately, it's kind of, there's no way for the system to realize like this person has left it mostly in forest land. They've done a great job on their own level of conserving the land. And I don't have a plan yet for how you can convince them to sell, but I know that that's ongoing discussions within the village of thinking about, is this a possibility? But when you think about, look at the rest of the river, you have a lot of very large tracts that are right next to each other of protected or nearly fully protected zones, and this is the only one that has potential. So if they were to ever sell it off and decide, actually, yeah, I'm going to do a giant subdivision or something here, that would probably be your biggest risk factor in that. Well, that's even though he's doing that, I have to hide the meeting controls every time. Okay. So that I think is your biggest opportunity area, is focusing here, your comp plan and your northern area study plan and whatnot, and some of your thoughts in relation to the business park that will be going in on the east end of this. All definitely have some tidbits of good ideas of how do you maintain connectivity between the trails that would be accessing this area. So I agree with all those plans. But I think the main thing too is you have all these tax increment districts, one that's on kind of near the highway here on the left side, but it doesn't really designate within that where the lighter versus heavier uses might be. So that's something that I have yet to talk with Alex Allen from your planning staff to figure out, like, okay, well, something's proposed. Are you trying to prioritize within those zones, or is it just kind of a blanket statement in terms of a zoning overlay? But I did see some concern for there's not a whole lot of existing protection or existing natural habitat already that's nearby there, but what can we do to maybe make a buffer? And I think my main thing here is let's focus on the buffer lands. It's already working for you. You know how to do that. You've been doing a good job with it. And then when you get to the engineering part with Windslam and whatnot, then thinking about in the other areas, where can you be putting in, rain gardens or other traditional green infrastructure practices, as opposed to naturally occurring things if you restore stuff. Gotta get my mouse back on the screen. Okay. Zone 2, so moving just to the western side, this is currently outside of your existing village boundary, but there was a lot of discussions about annexation and various municipality zoning things. This is very close to the area where lots of people own lots of things, and they're all right next to each other, and figuring out who will be managing a lot of these resources. This is a big tributary stream that goes into the Yahara, and there's definitely a small buffer alongside it, but it's mostly ag land right now. So they can't farm all the way up to the edge. It makes sense. But I keep thinking about, as you're expanding and annexing, and I think that these are some of the communities that might be annexed first, if I remember correctly, some of those lands in the portion of this near the north end, I think, Judd. That's probably a good place to focus efforts on creating some sort of buffer along the river. And it also just happens to be, if there's any good way to cross the highway, under the highway maybe, or having a separate trail system that folks in your area seem to really enjoy those. As well as another opportunity, when I mentioned potentially restorable wetlands, this is an area that is ripe with them. If you look at that map, which I don't have up here right now, but there's a lot of that area in that area, which could help you when you're thinking about creating a buffer zone, to look at some of those key parts of what could we restore from ag land and reconnect specifically the hydrology, so you don't have increased flooding and potential residential expansion or business expansion in that area. All right, getting my mouse back to the screen again. Where is it? That screen. Okay. And then moving closer to the entrance to the Cherokee Marsh area, kind of zone 3. Right here, there's a TID number 8, which is basically kind of a light industrial office building-y type of area right now, which I definitely see there being potential for issues with this stretch between the two highways. If there was some way to require those proposed businesses, because not a whole lot has gone in here yet, to, maybe they can offset some of those costs of being able to have a buffer zone along the river. And this would be, I think, a good spot for maybe some more permanent conservation. So not just, oh, we're going to put a grassway here, whatever, but maybe making it into a smaller park or something like that, since there is connectivity to the residential areas to the east to some extent. I don't know. You'd have to make some sidewalks and whatnot because of the highways. But that goes directly into there. And then slightly to the east, in the South DeForest area, there's this residential area going in, as well as kind of this business park expansion within TID 7, which right now you're doing great, but I don't know what happens when you have a lot more developed going in, how much additional pressure there might be. And this is one of your largest other already protected tracks coming in from Token Creek, which then flows into the Yahara. So I think that prioritizing efforts in that area as well, and maybe considering having different setbacks for this region. I'm not entirely sure how that might work, given that it seems like that's how this residential area is building out closer towards the river. And then kind of lastly, we already started the community engagement piece of this very, very briefly, of just kind of planting the seed of how this might move forwards. We've been showing up and hosting a couple events with kids all the way up through retired folks, and people are definitely interested. However, they were not included in the process of how do we set goals, where should we put stuff, what should how big should a buffer be, what do we want to prioritize in these kind of protection zones. And I think that this can be used as a discussion point for those future engagement sessions, which we've already been talking a bit, Jed, about how to possibly incorporate that when the school year starts. And I've got some extension staff who are willing to come help run some workshops with you. And I've talked to Alex a bit about it as well, and he's on board from that perspective to be able to then have the community actually involved, use your Engage DeForest site as well as your new parks plan that just came out. I just saw the comprehensive update this week online. I was like, oh, that would have been good to have for this. So though I know that plan, just skimming through it briefly earlier this week, definitely has a lot of good ideas that I think pair with all of this. The other bit is engineering. I was very ambitious, overly ambitious, and thought, yeah, I'm going to learn how to do this, which I am now being trained in a couple of weeks to start that process myself through my new job. But I know your current consultant is very capable of being able to do that. And I think that kind of, if you're able to plan and say, this is what we're hoping for priority zones, they can help you within that then to prioritize different types of best management practices, where, how to size them, where they should be, how much do you want it on the gray infrastructure end versus the green infrastructure end, what does the community think of all this? And so I think those are the two biggest missing pieces of this puzzle, since I know that was the biggest hope from, or at least I know Greg has mentioned it verbally a bunch, as well as you, Jed, of this is what we'd like to be able to hit the ground running. But I think that this at least gives you, from a planning perspective, where you should be prioritizing your efforts a little bit, and mostly focusing on that buffer situation around the riverway rather than any specific other recommendations. And so that is everything that I had to share with you all today. And we're exactly at 30 minutes and 6 seconds.